John Bush. How are you doing, sir?
Good, how are you?
Pretty good, man. Glad to have you today.
Glad to be here.
So we were just talking with John Goodvibes of the Intel Hub about his article, A Volunteer's Perspective on the Constitutional Law Debate. And before you came on the line, we were both sort of just giving our stances on that and the use of it. And I wanted to bring you on today to continue conversations that me and you have had in the past on other shows about the Constitution, Lysander Spooner's ideas, and also how it relates today. Because as I was just saying, we've seen like Vanity Fair, we've seen a number of magazines, the New York Times write articles about getting rid of the Constitution and how it's unnecessary. And I just wanted your opinion, your ideas on what that says, where we're going in 2013. So what do you have to say, sir?
Sure. Well, it appears that there are certain factions, globalists, the establishment that holds a lot of power, that's trying to move away from the Constitution, but towards a more controlling, centralized, authoritarian type of governance and means of organizing society. And then there's others that are trying to move away from the Constitution, however, moving towards a position of a more free society, because as we can get into, there's many aspects of the U.S. Constitution, even in its very limited originalist form, that are antithetical to individual liberty and free markets. And what I see happening now, and what's been happening for centuries or even longer than that, is a push to centralize with a simultaneous push to decentralize. And I think the sharing of ideas and the phenomenon of the Internet and the movements that are breaking out all across the world, the little guy that's trying to create a decentralized, peaceful order actually has a better shot than they've ever had in the history of civilization to actually compete with those that are trying to create that centralized institution. But one of the problems that I've found is many individuals in the so-called liberty movement that profess to want to see a more free society or a genuinely free society seem to have an adherence to an institution which has created an environment that is not very nice to individual liberty, free markets, or the idea that people have a right to self-determination, and that institution is the U.S. Constitution and the government that it created.
Definitely. We're going to go to a quick break, John. We're going to come back and discuss the limits of the Constitution. Welcome back. Welcome back to the Conscious Resistance. Some people want us to go back to 1776, the age of constitutional perfection, when life was great and there were no issues, apparently. But is it possible that the very document we try to get back to contained elements that helped create the society we're living in now? What do you think, John Bush?
That is entirely possible, for sure. And it's also worth noting that 1776 was an entirely different scenario than 1789 and beyond. And even before 1776, when you go back to the roots of the founding of this nation by Western European folk, it was rooted in monopoly, coercion, unjust institutions, inequality, privilege of the state. And if you recall, the first settlers, most of which were part of British Crown corporations, whereby the British Crown granted a geographic monopoly to a corporation that was going to go essentially extract resources. And those folks who were granted the monopoly even brought with them slaves and indentured servants. There's a great book by Taryn Lupo called The Pirates of Savannah that covers the life of someone who was brought to the States in Louisiana as not Louisiana, where was it? Georgia, brought in as an indentured servant, and it goes in detail about what their lives were like. But ever since the beginning, the whole idea of what this country's been has been a lot more in line with tyranny and control, except if you're a small portion of that privileged majority or minority who had the freedom and the protection of their property rights and the right to self-determination from the get-go. But in reality, all the Constitution represents is a throwback to the old order that existed before the American Revolution, whereby a small group of privileged elites are able to exercise monopoly power over a large geographic area for the benefit of the few at the expense of the many.
When someone comes across this information, and as you said, like in the liberty movement, there's plenty of people who still cling to the Constitution and almost, I guess, they have their own form of cognitive dissonance when faced with these ideas that the Constitution isn't perfect and that we can do better than that. What are the solutions that they should pursue? I mean, for a lot of people, this is where they've rested their entire philosophy, their entire political beliefs on the fact that at one point we had this perfect union that was ran in a manner that we've just somehow gotten off the track from.
Sure. Well, yeah, and it's also worth noting that a return to the government as idealized by the 1789 Constitution would definitely be an improvement from where we are today. However, it's likely that we would simply return to despotism in an even faster, more rapid rate because there's something inherently wrong with the institution that was laid out in the U.S. Constitution and the institution of state as a means of organizing society in general. But I think it's important just to point out some inconsistencies that often will create cognitive dissonance in many people's minds, cognitive dissonance in most people's minds, but there are some that will be able to see through or past the cognitive dissonance and just ask people, whether they dedicate themselves to principles or to a piece of paper or a particular government in one period of history. If your principles are for individual liberty or freedom for all or collective liberation or free markets even, say, well, let's point out the examples of how the U.S. Constitution interferes with individual liberty, and it's completely ripe with that, just empowering economic controls over the entire geographic region, whether it's the form of the tariffs or any other of the taxes or the ability to take out credit on the backs of the American people that came from Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1, the taxing clause, and then Clause 2, a mini Federal Reserve almost in a sense in itself, the ability to borrow money on the credit of the United States. And then also ask their people in the free markets, obviously, again, with individual liberty, if you have the ability to tax someone against their will and coerce them into extracting resources out of them, that's antithetical to individual liberty and self-determination. And if you're for a free market, how could you be for a tariff, an institution that's solidified in the U.S. Constitution, that a civil war was fought over in many regards? How could you be for giving one institution the ability to coin money, regulate the value thereof, and of foreign coins, standard measures? How could you be in favor of even making silver and gold a requisite of paying off debts? There's many people that point out that the United States government had little to no silver mines at the time of the U.S. Constitution, and forcing debts to be paid in silver money was a way of further tethering the new United States government to the British Crown and the Bank of England, because they were some of the larger holders of silver and gold. So just ask people if they're into principles or are they into some institution that was an idea that was put out by imperfect men. And if people want to just go back to it, sure, that's, it's a fine position, but I think we could go forward to something much better that won't simply have us continuing a perpetual cycle. That's not how I want to live my life, or that's not what I want to leave to my posterity.
I use a quote from you that I guess I steal. I've heard you say a couple times, and I'm sure, I don't know if you came up with it yourself or heard it from somewhere else, but I talk a lot about the fact that we don't want a revolution, we don't want to revolve and go in circles, but we're trying to evolve and move forward and step out of that line of thinking. And in some ways, harking back to the Constitution, and yes, and choosing to not recognize these inconsistencies is just another. I mean, it's just another trap in the matrix, so to speak. Something that, in my eyes, will just lead us to another state. If the Constitution didn't stop it this time, how could it stop it again?
Yeah, just like the Spooner quote, either the Constitution created the problems we have or is powerless to prevent it. And, it makes perfect sense. Many of those founding fathers, most of them were attorneys, most of them were creditors. Little manufacturing interests were represented in the Constitutional Convention. In reality, what it was the one percenters of the day that saw an opportunity to create a more centralized government, a more centralized institution to further extract wealth and live off the backs of, as parasites of everybody else, off of the productive class. And that's exactly what they did. And they weren't even tasked with creating a new government at the Constitutional Convention. They were merely tasked with amending the Articles of Confederation, which required unanimous consent of all of the states and the colonies. And that's not what happened at the Constitutional Convention. They didn't have unanimous consent. Instead, it was essentially a coup d'etat whereby they instituted an entirely new government with entirely new taxing authority, the ability to regulate interstate commerce amongst the states. And for people that say that the Articles of Confederation led to chaos and disorder, you know, sometimes when you're forming a new nation or when you're experimenting with the principles of liberty and actually putting it in a practical use, there might be a little bit of chaos. There might be a little bit of turmoil. It might take a little while before markets and peaceful trade amongst states or colonies comes to some sort of equilibrium. But here you had the Articles of Confederation. It wasn't about 10 years, a little more than 10 years later, that you already were trying to create this new central government without even giving this more free society an opportunity to flourish. So, yeah, the Constitution, you got exactly the motives that you got what came out of some people that were looking for their own self-interest. And they gave themselves the ability to borrow money on the credit of the United States. They even worked in all sorts of clauses to have an electoral college actually pick who the president is to make sure that it remains within the elite class. And it's obvious who the presidents have been since then. And, you know, many of them, like Alexander Hamilton, were well aware that these institutions would be exploited. And by using clever legal language, lawyer language, I mean, they left so many open holes in the thing. The whole thing didn't even pass with the Bill of Rights. That only had to be added on any later. And for anybody to think that that actually made a difference, you can just look at the long train of abuses of civil liberties and every single one of those rights enumerated in the Bill of Rights from the beginning, with the Whiskey Rebellion, people being put down and shot down by a militia called up by Alexander Hamilton and George Washington. Killing Americans, and Americans dying marching out on the way to kill Americans. That sure does away with someone's due process. And then the Alien and Sedition Act shortly thereafter, one of the first acts of Congress is to make it illegal to criticize the president.
That's all right.
This is all occurring. And then Andrew Jackson, who everyone puts on a pedestal for him fighting.
We're gonna continue this in just a second, John. We'll be right back with John Bush on the conscious resistance. Thank you, guys.
The world is on fire. The poison in the water as this motherfucker burns.
John, you were just talking about the Whiskey Rebellion and examples of the way that the Constitution has already been used to suppress the people in the past, and it has not been able to limit the federal government in the past couple hundred years. And now we're in 2013, where we face a state and a government that has made it amazingly clear that they do not care about our rights, passing the National Defense Authorization Act for the second year in a row, FISA amendments allowing warrantless spy tapping, and all these types of things that many of us are aware of. And there's a number of solutions that are proposed, whether it's taking political channels or actively trying to fight the government or stocking up on guns and all types of things like this. But both of us have chosen to take Agorist methods and to work to create alternatives to the system that we currently see. And I wanted to kind of get into that a little bit about what you see and any advice you have for people going into 2013 and focusing on solutions this year.
Sure. There's several different aspects of life and survival and thriving that we can create alternative institutions and live a better, more free, more active, healthy, happy lifestyle without needing to ask permission or needing to have a piece of legislation passed or needing the help of institutions that rely on coercion to exist. And we have a lot of these ideas on a new project we're working on. It's called Sovereign Living, and the website is sovereignliving.tv. That's SOVEREIGNLIVING.tv. And essentially, some of the first things people can do, the goal is to live a more free life, happy, healthy. I think that's all part of it. And one of the first things people can do is change the way they eat. and what they put in their body. Because it's one thing to be a slave to the state. It's another thing to be a slave to chronic disease and illness. And it's important to note that we have even more power and the ability to take control of that and to not be slaves to our own health problems. And, of course, when you have more energy and more vitality, you're able to create a more world better and live a better, more active lifestyle. At least in my opinion, that would be a better thing to do. And in order to further that end and also further other ends of being able to survive, period, of course, we all have to eat. So growing a garden in your backyard or on your porch if you live in an apartment or in one of your bedrooms is one of the best places that people could start if they want to focus on solutions and changing their lives and empowering themselves. Community gardens as well, like Houston Free Thinkers is doing. There's many community gardens in Austin. We're about to set one up here on our property. There's also larger local farms. People can get involved in labor-sharing programs where you go and put some work and they give you boxes of vegetables. So I think getting control and being more sovereign where there's no authority, you're not reliant or dependent on other institutions in order to provide sustenance for yourself or your family or your community, is one of the most important things that we could do to take control of our lives and also create a more free society, and that in turn will lead to a more healthy lifestyle as well whenever you're eating the food that you grow that doesn't have poison and toxins included in it as well. Alternative currencies, of course, are a great way. You know, one of the Agorist ways to end the Fed, everybody's saying end the Fed, end the Fed. End the Fed, let's pass a bill to end the Fed like the Congress really wants to take away its access to the magic money machine. It benefits from it as well. I think it's not very smart to rely on an institution that benefits from the Fed to end the Fed. So how about we take practical steps in our own lives to end the Federal Reserve by limiting or ceasing our use altogether of the Federal Reserve note and participating in alternative currencies or counter-economic activities or simple barter and trade. Reducing our cost of living also goes a long way not to provide wealth and use to the Federal Reserve note. So setting up these alternative currencies, getting involved with Shire Silver or the guys at Don't Tread on Meme with the dime cards, Wayne Walton with the Mountain Hours and Ithaca Hours. Creating alternative currencies is a wonderful thing people can do. You know, all these things I think will be able to provide more value in people's personal lives. Additionally, I think these are greater steps we can take if our goal is to create a free society. I think this is a more beneficial use of our time compared to campaigning and stumping for the latest bill to pass.
You know, I feel the same way, John. For me personally, I mean, I think I was already moving in that direction, but after going to the RNC this year to report on the events and Paul Fest and, get reports from delegates directly in there, and also just to cover the police state, that whole experience being there, covering that, and seeing, not that I had any faith really that anything different was going to happen, but just seeing how directly the Republican Party was willing to change their own rules and literally change the rules of the game. And it just solidified for me that if anyone comes close to beating this system, the state at their own game, they're just going to change the rules. And I don't understand why people still persist in trying to work with them. And also just the very fact that I'm tired of working with liars, murderers, and thieves and refuse to do so at any point in my life from this point on. So definitely pursuing any alternative to this. And for me, you know, I don't know what your opinion is on this, but for me, I've had to defend agorism in a number of ways because some people simply see it as, oh, you just think you're going to go ignore the problems away and things like that instead of creating, seeing it as creating something new that we could use to empower ourselves in the now and in the future. But I sort of see agorism as a transitional period where, and we've talked about this as well, like how much of our life do we give to agorism? Balancing between having bank accounts or, contributing to the system financially and using Federal Reserve notes and balancing that against how many people we can reach. So it's a difficult thing. And I feel like those who can take the steps now or who have the ability to take the steps now to create alternatives are really going to lay the groundwork for others later when the economic structure starts to wither away and these systems become necessary and they start to really pursue alternatives. And then these systems can become more empowered. But right now, they seem like small steps, just starting a garden or a few businesses operating on a silver network. But these are all important things if we're going to be forward-thinking people.
Yeah, man. Yeah, for sure. And there's many things that people can do that in many ways are agorism and counter-economic and anarchist activities that aren't risky and that won't end up putting you in jail or taking you away from your family. And again, those are like growing your own food. It's not illegal everywhere, at least. And also participating in these labor exchange type programs or using silver as a medium of exchange is not illegal either. It's a low-risk activity that many people can get involved with. And I think it's important that just as we think it's wrong for people to use the government as a means of providing health care for people, that we also note that it may not be the best way for providing freedom for people, because the institution of government in itself is entirely antithetical to freedom and individual liberty, because it's relying on, coercive monopoly. So why would we use the very institution that we're trying to do away with or get away from in order to bring about the ideal society that we want to create? It's up to each and every one of us to take small, proactive steps within our own lives to begin either starting or participating in existing alternative ways of organizing our lives. And we'll find as we do it peacefully, happily, our standard of living will increase. The masses will start taking note and getting curious about what it is that this group of people is doing that's allowing them to still function and be happy within society and be productive. And, the Agora will completely grow, and hopefully one day will be the favorite way of organizing society without violence or coercion. The state will be a thing of the past.
John, I was just saying, I'm thankful to have you on the show. I appreciate you coming on. Everyone who's tuned in, check out John Bush's work at sovereignliving.tv. It's the new project he's working on. I appreciate you coming on to talk, John. And
Thanks,
we'll have
man.
you back on soon.
Keep it up.
Yeah, thank you.
Free thinkers.
Thank you, John Bush.